Hello, this is the Apauline Christian reading from my book, An Apauline Theology. I'm going to be reading Chapter 4. Chapter 4, Ephesus, 54 AD. Did Paul believe in the resurrection? In 54 AD, Paul's crew arrived in Ephesus and found it to be one of the most beautiful and flourishing cities they had seen. Paul was hoping Ephesus would be a new home base, just as Antioch had been for him. This would allow his team to achieve smaller missionary journeys around the area. More visits would mean better maintenance of their new churches they had planted throughout Greece and Asia. Paul gave Timothy a special mission. He had been sent out to all the major cities throughout Greece and Macedonia, preparing the way for Paul's upcoming arrival. John Mark, and possibly Barnabas, had also found their way to Ephesus. They were well known and liked by the community. Yet Paul had found that this same Jewish community of Ephesus had been quite troublesome for him. Early on in Ephesus, Paul had written the first letter to the Corinthians. Paul had preached on topics found in his letter and on the gospel of grace every chance he had. Paul was a tent maker, so while he did go to the temple first to spread the message, he would often be found at the market. When the apostle John arrived, he was warmly welcomed by Silas, as they knew each other from Jerusalem. John and Silas discussed the resurrection and what it looked like. Silas mentioned that Paul's letter to the Corinthians, Paul says that the flesh does not inherit the kingdom of heaven. John finds this to be alarming, as Jesus did rise in the flesh. John basically states, if anybody claims that they had not seen the resurrected Christ without flesh, that they were actually seeing the Antichrist. Paul says, so did Paul actually believe in the resurrection? Paul says that if we do not confess to believe in Jesus' resurrection, that we will not have salvation from God. This is a key tenet to the faith alone belief that was found in the Gnostic churches of the first few centuries of Christianity. The Gnostic Christians' denomination was brutally stomped out in the 400s by the Roman Empire. Gnostic means knowledge. Their belief was that knowledge saves you, regardless of the actions you take or the sins you commit. Nearly 20 years after Paul died, Marcion of Sinope was born. Though Marcion never met Paul, he did grow up reading most of Paul's letters, as his father was a bishop and a friend of Paul. Marcion was a huge fan of Paul's teachings and promoted the gospel of grace throughout the empire. As Marcion owned many ships and had a great ability to produce music, his sailors would go from port to port singing catchy, faith-alone hymns. By the time Marcion reached old age, the early church had become highly concerned with this growing Gnostic Christian movement. A big component to to knowledge saves, is tying the mind or spirit to heaven and the body or flesh to hell. The concept is found heavily in Greek culture. This division could lead to sayings such as, we are not a body having a spiritual experience, but rather a spirit having a physical experience. The issue here is that it treats us as trapped in a body instead of the Judaic understanding that we are both body and soul. Did Paul actually believe in the flesh and blood resurrection of Jesus? We know he did not, as he tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 50. Could it be that he was just seeing a vision? That's what the apostles thought Paul was saying. But Paul himself claims that this is not what happened. He says it was the same resurrection as the apostles experienced. That while angels appeared to others before Jesus, now God speaks directly to us through Jesus. Again, so we can understand what Paul is saying. Moses only spoke to an angel, not to God, and not to Jesus? This logic is that because now Paul can speak directly to the spiritual Jesus, he is receiving a superior message than the other prophets before him. Paul's Jesus can even correct the older teachings of Jesus had given to the 12 apostles. Spiritual Jesus even gives strict orders to Paul that he must learn about the gospel of grace in the wilderness of Arabia, far away from the apostles, because they would never accept the testimony Paul has of spiritual Jesus. Now, if this is true, that Paul spoke to Jesus directly, why does Jesus not appear to John in Patmos directly? Why send John, an angel, and not come himself? Because Jesus said he would not return again until the temple is destroyed. If anyone claims to see him, to not believe them. So, I end every chapter with a prayer to St. Jude. If you would stay with me for this. Dear St. Jude, please help these words I have written be picked up and tested. Allow the reader to open their Bible and bring forth the true meaning of biblical text for themselves, for all those they share it with, especially that they may share their findings with me. Amen.